Almost loaded. It's working. Okay. All right, we'll just give it a minute to let people log in, and then we will get down to work. I hope that everybody is doing well. Just a little bookkeeping before we start. Next week is the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, and I imagine that you, along with me, are going to be involved in some Thanksgiving preparations. And so we will not be having our Lunch and Learn or Mishnah class, if you join me for that in the evenings, next Wednesday. That's the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. We will not be having class. I'll try to remember to remind people at the end of class as well, but I wanted to make sure I didn't forget it, at least at the beginning. All right, we've allotted our usual delay to begin. So let's go ahead and begin. We are in Chayei, and it may be hard to believe that we began with Abraham's life, well, then known as Avram, married to Sarai only a couple weeks ago, and now we are already coming to the end of their chapter in the Torah. It is shocking how fast the whole process goes because the text is so rich and so varied. In fact, for today, to highlight the richness, the varied nature of what we can learn from each of the different passages, I thought we would do a little bit of an experiment. We are going to focus on one verse in particular, and we are going to look at it from 4 different angles, and in the process, hopefully find many different layers of meaning, of understanding, and of personal importance. So I still want to go over the general outline of the episode of Chayei, the beginning, but just buckle in as we dive very deep into to one part in particular. But I'm not going to tell you what until we get going. So we are in chapter 23, and we are picking up from verse 1. Sarah's lifetime, the span of Sarah's life, came to 127 years. Sarah died in Kiryat Arba, now Hebron, in the land of Canaan, and Abraham proceeded to mourn for Sarah and to bewail her. Then Abraham rose from beside his dead and spoke to the Hittites, saying, I am a resident alien among you. Sell me a burial site among you that I may remove my dead for burial. He needs to find a place to bury his wife. And the Hittites replied to Abraham, saying, Hear us, my lord, term of an honorific term. You are the elect of God among us. They've kind of noticed his successes. Bury your dead in the choicest of our burial places. None of us will withhold his burial place from you for burying your dead. A very kind and gracious offer that they are saying that you can bury wherever you like and just choose one of our tombs and you can add your wife there. Thereupon, Abraham bowed low to the landowning citizens, meaning to the people of the land, the JPS giving us a slightly different twist on that, the Hittites. And he said to them, if it is your wish that I remove my dead from burial, you must agree to intercede for me with Ephron, son of Zohar. So Abraham seems to have something else in mind. It's not just enough to bury Sarah in one of the tombs of the people. He seems to have something in mind of wanting a particular tomb and one that's going to be a long-term right for him and his family to come. We do have a lot of other material, so I'm not going to go into it in the full detail, but just to paraphrase, he then gets into a long negotiation with this Ephron, and they work out exactly that this will be the cave of Machpelah, which is still in Hebron today, and that this will be a permanent possession for Abraham and his descendants, that he and his children and grandchildren may be buried there. And this is the first very official, very public land purchase in the entire history of our people in the land of Israel, or what will eventually be called Israel. So it has incredible historical significance, and it's very, very meaningful, but it is not where we're going to focus. Instead, we are going to come back all the way up to the beginning. Not the very beginning, but line 2 instead, because we see here that Abraham is mourning for Sarah and bewailing her. Now, these words are a little bit cumbersome. The bewail, I know they like to be fancy in the English translations, but he cried for her. The verb is simply the verb for crying, a cry of sadness in this particular case. Bewail sounds fancier, but he is crying about the loss of his wife. And to mourn, well, again, the verb lispod, it's mournful, but it's a mournful eulogy. A hesped is a eulogy in Jewish tradition. And so it is not just mourning in the sense of the English usage of being sad. It is a deeper honoring of the person who has passed while grieving for them. And the last thing I want to nitpick on the JPS translation is that we use the phrase, they have the phrase proceeded, and that is meant to translate vayavo. And there I'm going to actually cry foul. Vayavo literally means and came. Here, and Abraham came to give the eulogy for Sarah and to cry for her. Would be a more literalistic translation, which, as all of you I hope know, is not always better. It's not my preferred method because it often misses the meaning as needed in English, but it is important for uncovering the elements of the verse that might sound a little odd. And in this particular case, our tradition is very aware of this vayavo, that Abraham came and did all of the mourning rites, because why is he coming? From where is he coming? Was he not with Sarah at the time of her death? The fact that it literally means "and he came" opens up a whole range of questions that have very worthwhile answers through their investigation. So with those little incongruities noted, and on hopefully now fixed in your mind as looking for answers, we're going to look at 4 different ways of approaching the text and 4 different ideas of, or not ideas, but 4 different avenues through which we can learn from it. So the first avenue that we're going to explore is that of halakha. As this is the most detailed to date example of mourning in the Torah, it's not surprising that it is used to try and teach us some of the laws of mourning, of how we handle a death and a burial. We're going to start off with Sanhedrin 46b in the Talmud. And Abraham came to eulogize Sarah and weep over her. Again, a slightly more literal translation. This indicates that Sarah's funeral was delayed until Abraham returned, right? We see Abraham came. Well, if he came and then they eulogized and wept over her, and then he goes and arranges for the burial, then that means there was a gap between when she died and when she was buried. And that is striking, because in general, Judaism likes to bury a person as quickly as possible. Here, there appears to have been a delay for Abraham's arrival. And if you say that a eulogy is delivered due to the honor of the living, would they have delayed Sarah due to Abraham's honor? And the implied answer there is no. There's often a rhetorical no that is built into these kinds of Talmudic questions. It was satisfactory to Sarah herself, so that Abraham could be honored by her. So the notion here is that it is the eulogy is not delayed out of the wish to not offend the mourners that are coming. We don't delay burial for the honor of the living, meaning that, you know, we can't bury Sarah because Abraham's not here, and Abraham is such a great man, we have to wait for him before doing what is right for her. No, of course we wouldn't do that. Of course we would bury her immediately if it was just a question of his honor versus the act of burying her. However, if the honor is going to be to her and by her back to him, meaning that because we waited, it allowed her to be better honored. Thus, it is pleasing to her, meaning it is in her honor that it was delayed, in order that Abraham himself could be the one doing the eulogizing and honoring of her, and thus be honored by being mentioned with her, by being there for her funeral. Then, yes, we can delay. And indeed, this is the general halacha for modern times, that if there is a death of a loved one, we do not delay the funeral except to be able to do what is right for the deceased. So if it is, we need a day to make the arrangements in order that it is not rushed and thus not given proper due respect, then we take a day to make those arrangements. If we need a day to make sure that loved ones can fly from around the world or country to come and pay their respects and be able to eulogize the person properly, then yes, for the deceased's honor, we will delay. But do we put it on hold because their son is on vacation and we want to wait for him to get back so he doesn't lose his vacation time? No. Do we wait because someone has an important business deal and we don't want her to miss out on an important contract? No. Those are not reasons to delay that would be honoring the deceased. Those would be reasons to delay for the honor of the living. And that is not our priority when it comes to a funeral. And here we see Abraham giving a model of what is right, which is we only delay in order that we can do better for the deceased, not for those that are still around. And I will keep checking for questions and comments, but don't want to pause too much because, like I said, we do have a lot of text to get through today. Sometimes I just can't help myself. Now, to eulogize and to weep, as we see, usually weeping precedes eulogizing because of the mourner's grief, because the mourner's grief diminishes with time. In Sarah's case, her absence was felt more each day. So Kli Yakar is trying to make a statement about the greatness of Sarah, and he is looking at the particular order of the words in our parasha and saying, doesn't the crying normally come first? And then we wipe our tears and we begin the eulogizing process, which may cause more tears to flow again, yes, but the initial grief that comes in the immediate death, surely that would come first. And his argument here is not that that is wrong. His argument here is that with Sarah, as it became more and more apparent what she meant for the community and her family, that as the days went on, the weeping actually continued or indeed increased rather than diminished, because it wasn't only a sense of losing a loved one. It was realizing that an incredible person had been lost that was far above the average. But a person does not have to be of the caliber of Sarah for this to be true. I know for many people, it takes time before the reality of a loss kicks in and a person truly can feel their absence. It's one of the reasons why Judaism makes time for Shiva, for Shloshim, and for the other periods of mourning and our mourning practices, so that we will be able to realize what we have lost and grieve appropriately. Now, this last section on the topic of direct halachic importance is taken from a very interesting book that I only came across recently. It's called From Sinai to Ethiopia. And this is the traditions of halacha from the Ethiopian Jewish community, which was separated from the rest of the Jewish world for a very, very long time. But because they drew from the same sources, it is not surprising that they have very similar customs and practices. And when they refer to this text, well, we'll see. It sounds very familiar. It is a mitzvah for the relatives who are mourning to eulogize the deceased as appropriate and to mention his or her name. But one must not exaggerate in praise of the dead. In the eulogy, people should say things that arouse the listeners to reflection on the essence of human life and its significance, based on the life and behavior of the deceased. The custom of eulogizing the dead is ancient. Abraham eulogized Sarah from our verse. Customarily, eulogies are recited during the funeral and before burial. During Mishnah and Talmud times, there was a regular location for eulogies located next to the cemetery called a Beit Hesped. That's from that same word lispod for giving a eulogy that we saw earlier. So here we can see in this collection that the Ethiopian communities, although they had been distant from the other Jewish communities and out of contact, because they are drawing from the same passages in the Torah, because they are drawing from the same traditions of our people, they maintain this same custom of providing a eulogy and providing an opportunity to reflect on the life of the deceased, as well as to give all of the people present a chance to reflect as well. So those are just a taste of some of the ways that we can find meaningful insights into halakha, to Jewish law, from just this one passage. But obviously, there are many spiritual truths that we can find. And by spiritual truths here, I mean more than just things that would be put into the spirituality section of a bookstore. I mean actual insights into the nature of the spiritual world, the spiritual life. It is a great mitzvah to bury the dead and to eulogize them, and to take special pains to eulogize a Torah scholar and to weep for his passing. Abraham taught us this, as the Torah reports, Abraham arrived to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. Now, just pause for a second there and recognize a very interesting insight that might have been slipped past your notice, which is we are supposed to be giving, we're supposed to mourn and give eulogies for Torah scholars. And the example that's given is the example for Sarah. So the idea that Sarah herself was wise, insightful, and a person who was worthy of being mourned for her wisdom, not only just because she was a loved one of the family, is implicit within this comment. Even though this commandment is not listed as one of the 613 commandments, it is included in the general commandment, walk in his ways, meaning God's ways. Just as he buries the dead, as we see God burying Moses in Deuteronomy 34, so you too must bury the dead. So this insight from the Musar movement is trying to show us that in general, if we are to understand the nature of the commandments, sometimes we have to look more deeply than just what are the enumerated commandments, and to understand that there are implications of general commandments. If we are walking in God's ways, then we have to observe and connect to the fact that God also buries those that have no one else to bury them. And so too, we, because we are trying to imitate God, trying to follow God's ways, we must do so as well. So do not sit and say, well, there's no explicit commandment that says I have to do this. Instead, recognize that it is implicit by observing God's behavior in these types of situations. That is part of our spiritual life, is not only to abide by a strict reading, but to also look for a spiritual pathway that draws us in the ways of God. Now, from the Zohar, we take a different turn. Rabbi Abba noted that of all the women in the world, only for Sarah are the number of her days of her life in the world mentioned. As we saw, 127, and it's very, very broken down in the Hebrew. It's very explicit, as well as the place in which she was buried. This shows that there was no other woman in the world like Sarah, as is the Zohar's habit. It is trying to draw our attention to some of the irregularities in the text and to give us a peek through the veil to a deeper understanding of some of the things, the events, or the people that we have encountered. And here it's trying to say, you may have just written off the list of how old she was and where she was buried as a mundane activity, but recognize that since it is unusual for a woman to have both her age as well as her place of burial to be listed, that this is of special praise to Sarah. That, of course, would force a person to look more deeply and reflect upon Sarah, her life, and her behavior to try and understand what it is about her that sets her at that level. And one last insight from the mystical dimension. The mystical dimension of the name Hebron, which is Hebron, the city that she was buried in, is that the soul of everyone buried in that cave joins, mitchaber, the celestial city of God, meaning the four encampments of the Shekhinah. All right, now just hold on. Our patriarchs would not have made great efforts to be buried there had they not been aware of a profound spiritual dimension involved. They knew that the transfer to the true world, Olam Emet, from that site would be a crucial experience for them. It is the place from which the soul returns to their origin, the throne of God's glory. So Rabbeinu Bachya, transmitting a Kabbalistic interpretation, is saying that there is something special about Hebron, and you know it from the name. Hebron is mitchaber, is connected to this idea of being linked, of being joined together. Chaver is a friend. It means to be connected. That this binding together was significant. Now, also in typical Kabbalistic fashion, it might seem that initial idea takes a big leap, and that's fine. It's not everyone's cup of tea. But the idea being that as Abraham and Sarah were going to get such great pains to be buried there, with Sarah being in Hebron at her passing, and of Abraham coming to there and then going through the whole negotiation to purchase the place so that she could be buried there, that there must have been something significant in that site itself. And the idea here is that there is something very special about the cave of Machpelah, about that particular burial place, that was of spiritual significance to the deceased as they made their exit from this world into the next world. And that transition was going to be facilitated, enhanced, in some way would benefit from being from that launching point. Not too far-fetched, after all. We know that there are better launching places for rockets into space on this world. There's a reason we don't launch from Vancouver and instead launch from places closer to the equator. That actually is very logistically sound. Perhaps there is indeed then there's something as well for moving from this world to the next. I can't always say that mysticism or Kabbalah is my own personal cup of tea, but to put an insight into the actions of Abraham, of why was he so careful with why he wanted her to be buried there, I can certainly understand the desire to explain this in a meaningful way. And with a reminder that we transition from this world to the next, and that we should be as careful with that as we are with our life in this world, certainly that is a worthwhile lesson. Moving on to the historical insights that we can derive from this section. So by historical, I mean the actual understanding of the people, the events, the places, and what was going on. There is much that we can try to learn from this as well. So the reason the town was called Kiryat Arba, which is the other name for Hebron, which literally means the city of four, or at least that's one literal translation, is because 4 pairs of outstanding human beings were buried in the cave of Machpelah there. This is something that he hinted at in our last text. They are Adam and Chava, Avraham and Sarah, Yitzchak and Rivka, and Yaakov and Leah. Those are the 4. Now, 3 of those, the patriarchs and matriarchs, are well established in the text of the Torah. The idea that Adam and Chava, Adam and Eve, are buried there is understood through midrashic interpretation, but it is partly sparked by the fact that Kiryat Arba implies that there are 4s there, in this case 4 pairs that are there. And what would be the 4 pairs? Well, we have Abraham and Yitzchak and Yaakov being buried there quite obviously. We would just need another pair to be buried there to round it out. So this is giving a attempt at a historical understanding of the significance of this cave. Again, trying to explain why it was that Abraham asked for it by name very specifically and went to such great lengths to secure it, no matter the cost. Now, Ramban is going to give us first an interpretation of Rashi, and then give us a little bit more of a broader understanding of the timeline. Like I said from our initial reading, it seems a little odd that Abraham came to eulogize and weep, that vayavo seems a little out of place. So how do we understand it? What is it trying to tell us? Well, let's look first at Rashi as quoted by Ramban, and then Ramban's summary. Rashi comments, from Beersheba, meaning where did Abraham come from? He came from Beersheba. Now that makes perfect sense because we know that he had been in Beersheba seemingly before the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. So that makes sense. Now, this does not mean to imply that Abraham remained in Beersheba, as is indicated in the verse, and Abraham abode at Beersheba. For how then would Sarah have been in Hebron? Okay, so wait a minute. If we say that he's coming from Beersheba, does that mean he was living in Beersheba? Well, if he was living in Beersheba, what was Sarah doing in Hebron? Right? Were they living in different towns? I mean, they're not far apart. Nothing in Israel is really far apart, but they're also not next door to each other. Rather, the intent is to state that Abraham had gone to Beersheba for the day for some purpose. And while there, he heard of the death of Sarah and came from there to Hebron to mourn and weep for her. So the explanation here is that Abraham had gone back to Beersheba, but only temporarily. Like I said, they're not that far apart. And unfortunately, while he was in Hebron temporarily, while he was in Beersheba temporarily, Sarah died in Hebron, and he had to come racing back to mourn and to bury her. However, the expression of our rabbis is, this time from Bereshit Rabbah, and Abraham came, is from Mount Moriah. Now, Mount Moriah or Mount Moriah, depending upon how you want to pronounce that, is the site of the Akedah according to tradition. This is in accord with the Midrash, which Rashi previously cited, which states that hearing of the binding, meaning the near slaughter of Isaac, her soul flew from her and she died. All right, so now we've got two competing opinions. Either Abraham is coming from Beersheba, where he was temporarily busy with part of his, probably his estate that was there because he had the wells and such that were established, or he was coming from Har Moriah, from the Temple Mount, from the site of the Akedah, where on his way back, when Sarah had heard that Isaac was killed, she died from the shock. But those seem to be incompatible. Either he was in Beersheba or he was coming back from Moriah. He can't be doing both. Well, let's see. After the binding, the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, Abraham did not return to his place in Hebron. Rather, he went first to the Beersheba, the place of his tamarisk tree, to give thanks for the miracle that befell him. The fact that God reached out at the last minute, the ram was available, that Isaac did not have to be sacrificed. He is giving thanks, and he is returning to the site of one of his places of worship for God, and he is going there to give thanks. And it was there that he heard the death of Sarah, and he came to Hebron. The two apparently divergent opinions, namely that Abraham came from Mount Moriah and that he came from Beersheba, are thus one. Since, as explained, on his way from Mount Moriah, he went to the tamarisk tree, which was in Beersheba, there to give thanks for the miracle. So Ramban says we don't have to have two versions, one where he went to Moriah and one where he went to Beersheba and then came back to Hebron from either. Instead, he was making a multi-leg trip. He was at the site of the Akedah in what is now Jerusalem. Then he went down to Beersheba to give thanks at the site of that tree. And then he heard of her passing and went over to Hebron to prepare for the funeral and burial. So we can sort out the timeline while also paying respect to the different traditions of saying where Abraham is coming from. Questions or comments? I know I've been speaking rather rapidly. See, whenever I put a lot of material on the page, I always talk a little bit faster, and then sometimes I get ahead of myself. All right. So the final section, and the largest one for today, is going to look at Musar. Now, Musar is a tricky way of trying to say, these are the insights from this verse that are trying to tell us how we should actually go about living. Yes, halakha tells us that. And yes, obviously, insights into the nature of the spiritual life, as well as some of the events that took place and their historical locations. Obviously, those are important and incredible signposts for how we live. But they often don't provide the underlying psychological, emotional insights that can motivate and galvanize our efforts into living a good life. It is still right to live a life according to the mitzvot, even if you don't feel super enthusiastic about it and don't wait for inspiration before doing what is right. But there is a huge and rich tradition trying to give us insights that are not just there to show us what to do, but showing us how we should feel while doing it. So let's begin with our eulogy and weeping. In general, one weeps over the termination of the life of the deceased before eulogizing the loss to the living. Again, noticing that the weeping comes after the eulogizing in our verse. For the righteous, however, death is not a tragedy because they are then able to attain greater heights. Thus, it is only the loss to the living that is a cause for weeping. So the reason it didn't say crying, eulogizing, crying was because we don't need to feel bad for the deceased, because being righteous, we know that their future in Olam Haba, in the world to come, in the realm of eternity, is going to be even more splendid than their life here. But, this is a very important Jewish but, we are still able to mourn for them. As much as we hold on to the hope and the belief that the world to come will be an even greater life than this life, we who are still here, we weep for the loss of our loved one, and especially for the loss of the righteous as well, that it still impoverishes us for their spirit to no longer be physically with us in this existence. No matter how much we hold on to the promise of Olam Haba, we still have to feel the pain in Olam Hazeh, in this world. And that is a very powerful thing to hold on to, that grief is not somehow betraying the idea that we have faith in the world to come. Grief is a sign of how much we miss the person who has been removed from this physical realm. So it is appropriate to both hold on to that faith as well as hold on to the memory, even when the memory brings tears. Continuing with this kind of vein, we have to look even more carefully at who Sarah was that would instigate this type of tribute. And Abraham was old and well stricken in years, coming from the end of this week's Torah portion. Scripture states elsewhere, in reference to the verse, a virtuous woman is a crown to her husband. That's Proverbs 12. This verse alludes to Abraham, who mourned for Sarah. So a virtuous woman is a crown. Who would the virtuous woman be? It would be Sarah. Now, why would it be? Well, Abraham began to weep for her, saying, a woman of valor who can find? For her price is far above rubies. The heart of her husband safely trusts in her. This is from Proverbs 31, better known as Eshet Chayil. Now, it may surprise you that the Midrash is saying that Abraham knew the words of Proverbs, which wouldn't be written for another 1,500 years, roughly-ish. It's always hard to do the math in these places. At least it's hard for me. For a very long time, we can say confidently. But nonetheless, the idea is that the inspiration behind these words would be the same, and we can imagine this being the shape of Abraham's lament. So we are going to double check it, though, to make sure that this is not just a fluffy bit of text. When did he demonstrate his trust in her? Right? His heart relies on her. He trusts in her. When? He said to her, say, please, you are my sister. He trusted her with his life by asking her to put herself on the line to make sure that he would not be killed. She does good for him and not evil all the days of her life. She seeks between wool and flax. This is all of the continuation of Eshet Chayil. When? This alludes to her decision to separate Isaac and Ishmael, when she said to her husband, cast out this bondswoman and her son. Although a very painful episode, it was the right call that Ishmael and Isaac would go their own ways. It was not mean, petty, or vindictive, but we must understand that she saw something that made it essential for Isaac to be away from Ishmael. And we also know in the long run that Ishmael was taken care of. And so the separation was necessary at that time. Continuing from Eshet Chayil, she is like the merchant ships, for the woman was taken to Pharaoh's house, right? She is someone who went to Pharaoh's house, and later she went to Abimelech sent away, right? She went to and from. She had her own journeys and adventures. From Eshet Chayil, she rises while it is yet night. When did that happen? At the time Abraham arose early in the morning. Do you think she wasn't getting up at the same time? She considers a field and buys it. Again, from Eshet Chayil, from Proverbs. She thought about the field of Machpelah and acquired it. Now, we'll come back to that in just a second, but let me finish the breakdown of the proverb. She girds her loins with strength. When was that? When the angels appeared, as it is said, and Abraham went into the tent to Sarah, which can be alluding to both her the speed with which she reached out to the guests and to be hospitable to them and prepare for them, or her preparations for having Isaac, of becoming a mother, which, as we know, takes a great deal of strength. Now, I told we would get back that idea that she considers a field and buys it is implying the Machpelah. The implication here was that it wasn't entirely by random luck that Abraham decided to purchase Machpelah, and it wasn't even necessarily due to his own spiritual insight to choose it, but instead that Sarah had already set the wheels in motion, that she had already chosen that particular place as her burial, and that Abraham was in some way merely fulfilling her wishes, which is very significant and important. But the idea is that it, of course, elevates Sarah to a higher level, that it wasn't just that she was lucky to be buried in Machpelah because Abraham recognized that this was the right decision, but she herself was part of that process. And we'll move on, giving just a little pause for questions or comments. All right. And continuing with our insights and gleanings that we should have from this verse, Rabbi Yitzchak said, 3 matters evoke a person's sins: an inclined wall that is about to collapse, expecting prayer, and passing a case against another to heaven. What are we talking about? What do we mean by evoking a person's sins? What are these 3 things talking about? Well, evoking a person's sins is Talmudic talk for these are situations where the book gets opened and the balance sheet is checked very, very carefully to see whether you are deserving of some form of punishment. If you are sitting against a rickety wall, well, you know, that's a pretty opportune time for something bad to happen. So you probably shouldn't do that because you are tempting fate. Are you sitting against the wall thinking, I'm so righteous, I can sit against this ruin and nothing will happen to me because God will protect me because I am so righteous? That's the kind of thing that makes God check whether or not you're actually worthy of that level of protection. Expecting prayer, again, is a Talmudic euphemism, meaning that when you pray, you think that you have the right for your prayer to be answered exactly as you are formulating it. If you say, God, I pray that you give me $100,000, well then, by being, and you believe that that is exactly what you think you deserve for God to give you, well then God will check to see whether you deserve that prayer or not. And most likely you don't, because most of us are not deserving of that level of specific miraculous beneficence, and most of us wouldn't do right things with it in random ways either. But by forcing God to check the accounting, you're also tempting God to see that maybe there is something that you should be punished for. let alone be blessed for. And then the last one is the one most appropriate to our situation, passing a case against another. If you are claiming to God that another person has wronged you, you are bringing your case before the judge. And when you do that, the judge is going to look at the merits of all of the litigants. And are you really sure that you are more righteous than the person that you are complaining to God about? For we see, Rav Avin said, anyone who passes a case against another to God is punished first. As it is stated, and Sarai went to Avram, my anger be upon you, let the Lord judge between me and you, when she was first angry with Hagar. So what happens? And it is written, and Abraham came to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. So Sarah raised the case against Abraham. You and me, we stand before God, let him judge who is right. And even though God did agree eventually that Sarah was right, that Hagar and Ishmael had to go, the fact that she was willing to essentially accuse her husband in front of God as the divine judge meant that her record was examined earlier than his, and thus she passed away before he did. That this is not necessarily trying to tell us the historical timeline order of the things. That's why I didn't put it in that section, but it is trying to give a warning. If you think that you are so righteous that you can ask God to punish your enemies, be careful. Because even if it turns out you are slightly more worthy of being, better off than them, you are nonetheless doing something that is not ideal by dragging this sort of case before the judge, and you yourself will also be judged. Onward, as I'm trying to check our time here. The small kaf. Yes, I need to put back on that page because it wasn't obvious in this printing. There we are. You may notice that the kaf is a slightly smaller size. There are numerous letters throughout the Torah that are either smaller or larger, or that have dots over them, or other idiosyncrasies. And their explanations are often not 100% clear. We copy one Torah to the next, and that means that if the last Torah had a small kaf, the new Torah is going to have a small kaf too. But there are different traditions of what those small, big letters or dots can mean. The Otzar Midrashim here is giving us one explanation for what this small kaf could mean. The kaf in and to weep for her, the word that we were talking about, is small. Anyone who doesn't weep over a righteous person, a kaf, the palm tree, will strike them again and again. So the idea here is that when a righteous person dies, if you don't weep, if you are reducing your weeping, you are removing the kaf, if you will, then a literal kaf will hit you. And that word kaf can mean both hand as well as a palm frond. So you are essentially opening yourself up for abuse. That the death of any good person is a cause for mourning for any other person. In the classic line, do not send to ask for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee, from I believe that was John Donne, the English poet, is telling us that if anyone dies, it should be of concern to all of us. And likewise, this insight about the small kaf is telling us that as well, that we are obligated to weep when a good person passes. Don't ask, what did they do for me? Don't ask, well, did I know them very well? If they were a good person and they have passed, like we said, they may be going to Olam Haba, but the world is now short one good person. And that is cause for crying for anyone. And then our final text for today. I believe further that if Avraham and Yitzchak came in order to eulogize Sarah, then the Torah should have written that. So Rabbeinu Bachya is picking up on something that often gets missed, which is we see Abraham active in the burial of Sarah. Natural, he is the patriarch, he would be arranging for the grave, but we hear nothing of Yitzchak in the burial of his mother. We know that he mourned her because, as we see a little mention later, he is comforted when he finally marries Rivka, but we don't hear anything at this episode. Why not? What's going on? Yitzhak certainly should also have eulogized his mother and wept for her. It would be normal and expected. And as he's saying, you can't just imagine he was there because the Torah should have mentioned it if he was. In fact, his duty to do so would have been even greater than Abraham's, seeing that he was her flesh and blood. In Jewish law, the mourning requirements of a child are greater than the mourning requirements of a spouse. So really, he had precedence. In addition, the love Sarah must have lavished on Yitzhak, whom she bore after waiting for him for 90 years, must certainly have evoked reciprocal feelings in Yitzhak so that he would have eulogized her. It's not like this was Ishmael. I mean, this is her cherished one. So clearly he would have had reason to mourn. Perhaps at this point, Yitzhak had not heard yet that his mother had died. Seeing that Sarah's death had been attributed to the binding of Yitzhak, people might have tried to withhold the information from him as long as possible. So he hypothesizes that far from being a criticism of Yitzhak, that Yitzhak didn't know that she had died, that Yitzhak didn't care that she had died and didn't bother crying or eulogizing, it could be that it was just unknown to him. And there was no email, there were no faxes, no telephones, no simple postal services. And according to Midrash, Yitzhak had gone off to study after the Akedah. So he wasn't with Abraham when he was given the news. That's why we don't see Isaac and Abraham coming back together from the after the binding, the Akedah. So he didn't hear. But you could still argue, well, people should have made an attempt to try and get the information to him. I mean, after all, this was his mother. But since, as we saw, people often thought that the reason she died was because she heard of the Akedah, this would create so much pain and anguish for Yitzhak to realize that his near death resulted in her actual death, that people just didn't tell him, that they chose not to send for him, not to tell him that she had died, because then he would only be sadder because of that cause. This is the most likely reason why we do not hear a single word about Yitzhak in the whole section. In fact, we have not heard a word about Yitzhak ever since he took part in the binding on the altar. Possibly, Yitzhak had decided to remain for some time on Mount Moriah until he became 40 years of age when he married Rivka, where we know that we hear again then about his grief for the loss of his mother. So I wanted to finish with this because it's a very interesting insight into the way people can respond to death. And in particular, the non-mourners can respond to death. It seems that people decided not to tell Isaac about the death. And I feel that we are getting the hint here from Rabbeinu Bachya that doesn't seem right, that Yitzhak needed to mourn for his mother. Indeed, it seems that his mourning went on perhaps even overlong, and that might have been because he was not given the opportunity to mourn when it was most appropriate, at the immediate time of her passing. And he wasn't given that time because someone else thought he wouldn't be able to bear it, that he wouldn't be able to handle it. And honestly, unless a person is in a life or death hospital situation, that's not our judgment call to make. We need to let a person know what has happened. We need to let them know that they are needed now to go into mourning and to go into the grieving process, precisely because it will allow them to express their grief. Imagine Isaac's dismay learning that his mother had been buried without him in attendance because others had decided that he was too fragile to be there, that he would have been too upset. Of course he was going to be upset, and he was going to be upset eventually. Better to be there with his father, to be there with the rest of the community, to be there at the moment that was most appropriate and allow him to mourn with the support of the entire community, rather than then have to bear a further guilt that everyone thought so convincingly that he was the cause of his mother's death that they kept this information from him, which would have forced him to internalize that even more so. It is really a terrible decision to try and make on behalf of someone else, and one that I've seen too often people try to make. of, oh, well, I didn't want to tell you blah, blah, because it might have upset you. I didn't want to tell you blah, blah, because it would have upset you. Well, if it happened, it happened. Tell me, and then help me when I am upset. Don't think that you can protect me from being upset. Allow me to deal with my grief as I must and be there to support me through that. And that is how we will be able to manage these types of catastrophes. And I think that it is very telling that even here in the Middle Ages, we have this basic psychological study that Rabbeinu Bachia is hinting at, that is reminding us that we have obligations to help each other through grief, not to hide each other from grief or from these types of problems. And with that, we will finish with a few minutes to spare. Are there any questions or comments that people would like to share for the end? Just wait until I can see that the YouTube has fully caught up. All right, so I will leave it there. And as always, you're welcome to continue the conversation in the comments on the YouTube recording, or if you have something personal you'd like to talk about, to give me a call or email. I will also repeat our little bit of housekeeping that next week on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, we will not be holding our class. Keep reading your Torah, but we won't be holding our class because I know many people will be deep in the preparations for that holiday, which may not be a native Jewish holiday, but certainly reflects a beautiful Jewish concept. Give thanks, everyone, and I will see you next